Welcome everyone to the webinar with Dr. Dunn Preston. We're going to present him in just a few minutes. I'm sure if you're on this webinar, you probably know him well already. He and I have been friends for a long time. He is a scholar of the first rank and has been a very dedicated soldier in communicating the Word of God, defending it with debates and writing voluminously in books, as well as supporting it through his efforts, time, and through the dedication of his family, his work in the church. He's been with us for quite a few years, and in all of them, he has just been stellar as a presenter and defender. So, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him. I want to welcome each of you. Thank you for your time. Our schedule for tonight is for about an hour of presentation. I'm not sure how long Dunn is going to go. This is part two of the study on Colossians 2:14 through 16. And as you know, there's some area of disagreement in terms of what that passage is teaching, whether it is teaching the law ended at the cross or whether it ends in 70 AD, or if that is in fact what the subject of that text is. But I think it's going to be let me rephrase that. I know it's going to be a great study. And if this is a passage that you've been challenged with, then you will do yourself well to attend for the entire workshop. So thank you for being here. I'm glad you found it okay, and you all can, if you have an opportunity, leave us some comments. Now, we're going to have the webinar open for an additional 30 minutes afterwards in case there are some questions, if we run a little bit over, but we just tried to make sure that we had enough time in case Dunn needs a few extra minutes to cover what he has to cover. So with that, Dunn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, William, thank you very much. What I'm going to try to do here is remind myself of how to do this. I got to go over here to screen share, and that's where I want to be, right there. All right, and what I'll do is I'll just start back in. We covered this last week, but it's absolutely critical to see Hebrews chapter 8 and what it is actually saying. Now remember, Hebrews was written after Colossians. Colossians, we are told, supposedly teaches that the law passed away at the cross. But here in Hebrews chapter 8, the writer says, and specifically in verse 13, that the old covenant was in the process of passing away. Now, William, I want to make sure you can hear me. Can you still hear me?
Excellent.
Okay. Very, very good, because all I've got up is my screen, and I'm just going to leave this kind of a screen up so that I can just proceed down through there. But I couldn't tell if I was still up on audio or not. Hebrews chapter 8, 8 to 13, is a prediction of the passing of the old covenant. Now, most people would agree with that, at least on one level, but a strange thing is happening, certainly in the dominionist world, certainly as well to some extent in the amillennial world. They are now saying, for instance, in July of 2012, in my debate with Joel McDermott, he swore up and down that Hebrews chapter 8 did not predict the passing of the old covenant. It did not predict the passing of the old law. Rather, it spoke of the fact that it was simply the external ceremonial trappings, the sacrifices, the priesthood, the temple system, the ministration of the law, not the law itself, that was passing away. Well, my response to that was, and is, that once we read Hebrews chapter 8, and as you can see, I have verses 8 through 10 on the screen, but I did that for a very, very specific purpose. I hope everyone will read along with me. If that first, and as you can see, the word covenant here is in italics, indicating that the actual word diatheke is not in the Greek text, but this is what is known as this word covenant that has been inserted there in ellipsis is a form of ellipsis. I'll have a whole lot more to say about ellipsis here in a moment. I covered it last week, but it's so critical to catch the power of this word covenant and why the writers, or excuse me, the translators, inserted that, because they believe that this is a case of ellipsis in which the word covenant is absolutely not only understood, but demanded by the discussion and the context. So they have, if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. Well, a second what? A second covenant. Again, ellipsis. Because finding fault with them, that's with the people of Israel, he says, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. Well, here we have the Greek word diatheke in the text. I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they did not continue in my covenant, and I disregarded them, says the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. Now I want you to notice that including all of the elliptical statements, like right here and right here, we have the word covenant either explicitly stated or implied and demanded 6 times. The writer is very clearly not focused on something external to the covenant. He's not talking about simply some aspects of the covenant. He is talking about a new covenant. He is talking about a different covenant. And this covenant would replace the old. Now, I mentioned the word ellipsis, and as I mentioned, I covered this somewhat in our last program. Because the dominionists, postmillennialists, in order to escape the force of the words of Hebrews 8, many futurists, not just the dominionists, some amillennialists are making the same claim. They say that it doesn't say that the word covenant is there. In other words, it's not the covenant that had grown obsolete and was nigh unto passing in verse 13. But what Paul was actually saying, I take Hebrews as penned by Paul, but it means that the ceremonial ordinances, the cultic practice, the external trappings of the old covenant itself. So you have the covenant and you have the external ordinances, the ceremonial ordinance of the covenant were nigh unto passing. That was Joel McDermott's position in my debate with him. It was Harold Eberle's position when I debated him last year up in Oregon. Now I want to suggest to you this is nothing but an attempt to escape the force of the text. Listen to me very carefully, folks. If the Mosaic covenant itself, if the law itself was growing old and ready to pass away when Hebrews was written, then dominionism, postmillennialism itself is falsified. The entire house of dominionism falls to the ground. Well, I want to suggest to you the argument that Hebrews is talking about the passing of the external trappings of the old law, the administration of the law, or the ministration of the law, not the law itself, that fails to honor the grammatical and the journalistic reality of this thing called ellipsis. So let's go to the next chart, and I want you to follow closely here. What in the world is an ellipsis? Well, it's something that we very, very often use, but maybe sometimes we don't stop to think about it and its significance. So here's what the Free Dictionary found on the internet. You just go, do a Google search, define ellipsis. This is just one of the many, many, many sources that say this. It is, quote, the omission from a sentence or other construction of one or more words which are understandable from the context that would complete or clarify the construction, such as the omission of been to Paris from the second clause of I've been to Paris, but he hasn't. Well, we understood that this is ellipsis, or we understand that it is, even though we may not even know the word. We understand that if I say, well, I've been to Paris, but William hasn't, that I've really said William has not been to Paris. I don't know if William's been to Paris or not. Been a lot of places, but I don't know if he's been to Paris.
Not yet.
Okay. Well, we'll have to work on that one of these days.
There you go.
But the point of fact is, folks, we understand in normal everyday conversation, and even in writing, we understand it on a practical level. But those who argue from Hebrews chapter 8 that it was not the covenant that was passing away are failing to honor the use of ellipsis in the text. Remember, we've just demonstrated that the word covenant, diatheke, is used explicitly 4 times. The context, the discussion, is undoubtedly focused on the covenant. Not once. And you know, this was part of my controversy with Joel McDermott in my debate with him, of how on the one hand he would argue, well, I don't find a certain word in a given text, therefore that text can't be talking about what Preston says it does. Then he come to Hebrews chapter 8 and argue that it's talking about, well, the ceremonial trappings. It was talking about the administration. It was talking about the ministration of the law, even though those terms are absolutely not used, nor are they implied in any way to be the focus of discussion as opposed to the covenant. The subject in Hebrews chapter 8 is the first covenant versus the new covenant. It is not the ministration of the first covenant versus the ministration of a new covenant. That is absolutely not there. So we need to see the significance of ellipsis as we look closer at Hebrews 8. The use of ellipsis in Hebrews 8 demands. It doesn't just suggest it. It doesn't sort of kind of imply it. It demands that the author was saying some things about the covenant, not just the external trappings of the covenant. Look, folks, if you're going to say the writer was talking about the external trappings of the covenant and not the covenant, shouldn't there be some words in the text that indicate that he's delineating between the covenant and the administration of the covenant? Well, sure, there ought to be some indication of that. It is only because the dominionists have a preconceived theological bias that they refuse to see that the focus in Hebrews 8 is about the covenant. So, this means that it was truly a new covenant, not just a new administration of the old covenant. Now, notice how important this is. I will make a new covenant with them. He did not say, well, I will alter the old covenant and just simply make a new administration of the old covenant. No. He said, I'm going to make a new covenant that is not like the old covenant. So, the use of ellipsis means that it was truly a new covenant, not just a new administration of the old covenant that was promised. All you have to do is look at Jeremiah's promise. I will make a new covenant, not like the old covenant. So, this demands that it was the old covenant, not just the external trappings of the old covenant that was ready to vanish away. Now, I want to tell you something. This logically demands several things. If it was the old covenant, not just the ministration of the old covenant, not just the sacrifices of the old covenant, if it was genuinely the old covenant itself that was ready to vanish away, several things logically follow. So let's look at them. Again, the use of ellipsis in Hebrews demands the following. Number one, it means that it was the old covenant, Torah, The law of Moses, that was passing, or that was nigh unto passing. Well, guess what that does? That completely falsifies the view that Torah passed at the cross. Now, let me remind you, even some preterists, those who claim to be preterists, who once acknowledged that Hebrews chapter 8 says that the covenant was passing away, nigh unto passing, have now reverted to saying, no. The law was nailed to the cross in Colossians chapter 2. What the writer of Hebrews was saying is that it was the temple, the priesthood, the sacrifices that were passing away. Well, let me remind you once again, folks, none of those things are mentioned in Hebrews 9. What is mentioned explicitly 4 times is covenant, elliptically 2 times is covenant. 6 times the covenant is mentioned. Not 1 time is there a delineation between the ministration of the covenant, the sacrifices of the covenant, priesthood of the covenant. None of that is delineated from the covenant. So let me say that again. The use of ellipsis in Hebrews demands that it was the old covenant itself that was nigh unto passing. This alone falsifies the view that Torah passed away at the cross. You simply cannot properly, exegetically, and correctly insert words, thoughts, comments, and ideas into Hebrews chapter 8 without doing violence to the text. You cannot change the wording of the text from covenant to, oh, well, just the sacrifices of the covenant, not the covenant, without doing major harm to the text. So this use of ellipsis falsifies the claim that it was only the ministration of the covenant that was passing and not the covenant itself. Now, watch this very closely. If the law of Moses, if the covenant was nigh unto passing, this agrees perfectly with Jesus' words in Matthew 5:17 and 18, where he said, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law until it's all fulfilled. Well, look at Hebrews chapter 9. Jesus had already offered himself as a sacrifice, fulfilling the typological aspects of the Day of Atonement and the high priest on that day. He had already entered into the most holy place there to offer that sacrifice on the mercy seat, what was known as the hilasterion. Oh, but wait, he had not yet completely fulfilled all of the typological actions of the high priest of the Day of Atonement. Now, what's so significant about this, folks, is twice in Hebrews 9:23 through chapter 10, verse 1 and 2, the writer impresses on us as we read it that he's talking about the typological aspect of what he's talking about. That old covenant temple, that old covenant Day of Atonement, that old covenant sacrificial system was typological, and Jesus had already fulfilled part of it. He was about to fulfill the rest of it. This is the already, but the not yet of the Day of Atonement, of the process of atonement. Remember, Jesus said, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law until it's all fulfilled. Now, we're going to see here in a moment, we've already seen it, but we're going to see even more, where the writer of Hebrews emphasizes that the law was still, when he wrote, an active type, an active shadow of the things that had not yet come. Well, look, if those things had not yet come, then the types and shadows had not been fulfilled, and according to Jesus in Matthew 5, that means the law of Moses had not passed. Now, what the writer says in Hebrews 9:23 through chapter 10, verse 1 and 2, about the law being a shadow of good things to come, agrees absolutely perfectly with what Paul says in Colossians chapter 2, where Paul, writing to Christians, now I want you to listen very carefully to me, I'm going to come back and I'm going to touch this later. I'm simply going to take note of what Paul said right now. Paul writing to Christians who had died to the law. He did not say the law had died. He said they had died to the law. Romans 7 verse 4. But Christians who had died to the law, Paul wrote and said, let no one therefore judge you, you who? Those who had entered Christ through baptism, thus dying to the law. Let no man judge you in respect to new moon, feast days, or Sabbaths. Now notice, which are, present active indicative, shadows of good things, notice, about to come, translated from the Greek word melo in the infinitive, which means to be about to do, to be on the point of, to be on the verge of. So when Paul wrote Colossians, the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths were still, when he wrote, shadows of the good things that had not yet come, but were about to come. Well, again, this is absolutely critical. If the law had been nailed to the cross, if the law had been fulfilled, why didn't Paul say, don't let any man judge you in respect of new moon, feast days, and Sabbaths, which were a shadow of the good things that have now come? He didn't say that. He said they are, present tense, a shadow of the good things that are about to come. Now, I want you to notice something, folks. I want to do a direct comparison here between the absolute, utter inconsistency, the untenable, indefensible nature of modern-day dominionism and what the Bible actually says. Now, we've just established that it was dominionism itself, it was the law itself, Torah, not the administration of the law, but the covenant itself that was passing away, and again, not just the sacrificial system. I want you to understand this absolutely falsifies dominionism that claims that the Mosaic covenant, but without the external trappings, remains valid today. Do you catch that? The dominionist view is that the law of Moses, without the ceremonial trappings, the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, without the sacrifices, without the trips to Jerusalem, but Torah, without those things, remains valid. Now, here's where you begin to run into the utter inconsistency of the dominionist world. Now, this is one of many, many, many quotes that I can give. I'll allude to another quote here momentarily, and I can send you the documentation for it if you wish that. But right now, I want to focus on Deuteronomy chapter 8 and a quote from Gary North in his book, Millennialism and Social Theory, published in 1990, page 52. Now, Gary North, who, by the way, is Joel McDermott's father-in-law, commenting on Deuteronomy chapter 8, says, quote, this passage in Deuteronomy presents the biblical basis of progress in history, unquote. He then adds, quote, oh, you just got to catch the power of this. Any attempt to renounce this passage as no longer judicially binding in the new covenant era is inescapably a denial of any biblical basis for God-honoring cultural progress in history, unquote. Oh, my goodness gracious. Now, folks, remember, and you really, if you have your own Bible sitting there handy with you, You really, really, really have to turn there in your own Bible and read this for yourself. Because remember, he tells us this passage in Deuteronomy 8 is the biblical basis of progress in history. What he's really saying is this passage is the biblical basis for dominionism. He says any attempt to renounce this passage, Deuteronomy 8, as no longer judicially binding in the New Covenant era. In other words, do you see what he's doing? He's binding Torah on the New Covenant age. He says it is inescapably a denial of any biblical basis for God-honoring cultural progress in history. In other words, if you say that Deuteronomy chapter 8 is not binding, judicially binding on us today as Christians, then that means dominionism is false to the core. Well, let me say this. Dominionism is false. Look at what Deuteronomy chapter 8 actually says. Moses, now you have to understand that obviously there were no chapter divisions in Deuteronomy. So you have to understand that when Moses says what he does in chapter 8, you really have to go back into chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 to understand the power of what chapter 8 verse 1 says. All right? But notice what chapter 8 verse 1 says. Every commandment. I want to read that again. Every commandment, now notice, which I command you today. What commandments did Moses command them that day? Well, you got to go back to chapter 5 at least. Chapter 4 at least. There is no temporal break. None whatsoever. So, beginning at least with chapter 5, it is what Moses said that day. Okay? I'm going to start reading again. I'm driving this home because of how powerful this is. Every commandment which I command you today, you must, what? You must be careful to observe that you live and multiply and go in and possess the land of which the Lord swore to your fathers. Folks, I want you to follow me carefully here. Gary North says Deuteronomy chapter 8 is the law for Christians to observe today. Gary North says a rejection of Deuteronomy chapter 8 is a rejection of any basis for Christian influence in the world, for any progress in history. He says it is a denial of any biblical basis for God-honoring cultural progress in history, unquote. Well, I think that's absolutely false to the core. But now, catch the inherent, intrinsic, and fatal power of Gary North's own emphasis on Deuteronomy chapter 8. What did Moses say one more time? Every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe, that you may live and multiply, go in and possess the land of which the Lord spoke to your fathers. Okay, the question therefore is, what were some of the commandments? Not all of them. We don't have to know all of them. What were some of the commandments that Moses spoke that day, concerning which he said, you must observe every single one of these commands that I command you this day? Well, let's see here. Back in chapter 5. Verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work. But the seventh day, by the way, folks, that's Saturday, in case you didn't know that. The seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it what? The Sabbath, the seventh day, you shall do no work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. And remember that you were a slave. You got to remember and you got to obey every command that I command you here this day. Deuteronomy 8:1. Gary North says this is pressing and obligatory on Christians today. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath. Oh my goodness. Now, remember, folks, Deuteronomy chapter 8 says, you must keep every single commandment that I command you this day. Gary North says that is binding on us today as Christians. Now, that's in spite of the fact that it wasn't written to Christians. It was written to those who came out of the land of Egypt, to whom the Sabbath was given as a sign of that deliverance. But forget all that, okay? Just catch the power of this point. The commandment was keep the Sabbath. Now, do you realize, in my debate with Joel McDurmon, son-in-law of Gary North, I asked him if he observed the seventh-day Sabbath. No, he does not. Does Gary North observe the seventh-day Sabbath? Well, not so far as I'm aware. Do Dominionists as a whole observe the seventh-day Sabbath? No, they do not. Now, wait a minute. Gary North says we've got to obey Deuteronomy chapter 8, 1 and following. It's the basis for God-honoring cultural progress in history. It is judicially binding on Christians today. But what does Gary North do? What does Joel McDurmon do? What do most Dominionists do? Well, let me illustrate that by sharing with you what Greg Bahnsen, who was one of the most brilliant minds in all of Dominionism until his untimely death at the age of 42 some years ago. I admired Bahnsen a great deal. He and I actually had signed propositions for a public debate. But be that as it may, Greg Bahnsen, in his book on theonomy, discusses the Sabbath. Greg Bahnsen says the Sabbath is an eternal mandate from God binding on all men. Well, in other words, you would think that he would agree with Gary North. Deuteronomy 8 is binding on men because Deuteronomy 8 is, binds every commandment that Moses gave that day, and Moses gave the seventh-day Sabbath. But what does Bahnsen do? Bahnsen, I'm assuming Mr. North, Joel McDurmon, Gary DeMar, what do all of them do? They follow Greg Bahnsen in saying, well, the ceremonial aspect of Torah has been removed, which means the seventh day has now been changed to Sunday. Let's see here. Is that what Moses said in Deuteronomy 8? Every commandment that I speak to you this day, you shall be careful to observe. But Gary DeMar, Gary North, Joel McDurmon, none of the Dominionists, so far as I'm aware, observe every commandment spoken by Moses that day, because none of them, so far as I'm aware, observe the seventh day Sabbath. They observe the first day of the week Sabbath. They observe the eighth day Sabbath, but Moses did not say one single word about the eighth day Sabbath. He did not say one single word about the first day of the week. Moses said, you shall keep the seventh day Sabbath, which is Saturday. Folks, do you see the inherent, intrinsic, fatal nature of this absolute, utter inconsistency of the dominionist world when it comes to the law? Oh yeah, they want to tell us, as Greg Bahnsen did in his book Theonomy, well, it's all of those ceremonial trappings, and it's the accoutrements, and it's the sacrifices that were added to the law. Wasn't the law itself that passed away? Oh, well, Sabbath's been changed. Well, then Sabbath law changed, didn't it? And remember, Sabbath law is set firmly right square in the middle of the Decalogue, which they tell us has not altered, been changed, passed away. Folks, if the Decalogue has not passed away, then Sabbath, seventh day Sabbath, has not passed away. Well, naturally somebody jumps up and says, oh, you're saying the Decalogue passed away. That means it's okay to lie, steal, murder, covet, commit adultery, etc. No, it's not what I'm saying at all. Those things are all an intrinsic part of the character of God, i.e., they are against his holy character, his holy nature. So it was wrong to lie, to steal, to kill, etc. before Torah. It was wrong to do those things under Torah. They were codified, but they were codified in the covenant, which is what Deuteronomy is, the covenant. Therefore, the covenant, including the seventh day Sabbath, could be done away with without even beginning to suggest the idea that it's okay to be immoral. No, that's just a logical fallacy. But folks, I hope you see the power of what I'm saying here. When the dominionists say, well, yes, the law of Moses with the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths passed away at the cross, then they turn around and say, well, everything that Moses spoke in Deuteronomy is binding today. They are absolutely contradicting themselves. When they say that Sabbath has been changed to Sunday, they're contradicting themselves. And more importantly, they're contradicting Jesus, who said, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law until it's all fulfilled. Now, probably in our next session, we are going to be talking about the Sabbath a whole lot more. But I hope you've begun to see the power of the problem that is presented to the dominionists and the amillennialists and even the dispensationalists when they tell us on the one hand that the law of Moses has been done away with, and yet they then turn around and they want to appeal to the old covenant for the basis of their morality and for the basis of this or that or the other. All right? The bottom line here is, if the law of Moses, i.e., if Deuteronomy, the covenant, was nigh unto passing in Hebrews chapter 8, then the very foundation of dominionism crumbles to the dust. And furthermore, we have already seen from Gary North's own words how dominionism is contradictory. Remember, Deuteronomy 8 demands observance of every commandment, not just some. Every single one of the commandments that Moses spoke that day must be obeyed according to Moses and according to Gary North. And yet, as far as I know, there are no dominionists who obey every commandment of Torah which was spoken by Moses that day. This, folks, is an incredible, inherent, logical contradiction. Well, let's turn our attention then to look a little bit closer at why Colossians chapter 2 did not predict the end of Torah. That is to say, it actually does predict the end of Torah, but it does not say that Torah had already passed away, to clarify my statement there. Notice once again that Paul spoke of the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths. These are all, obviously, a part of what people like to call the ceremonial aspect of the law. By the way, I'd like to note, Greg Beale, a millennialist, does the same identical thing that Gentry and Bonson and McDermott and North do. And they say, well, the ceremonial part of the law has been done away with, the moral part of the law remains valid. But Greg Beale, in his Theology of the New Testament, massive work, very, very helpful in many, many ways, but so self-contradictory in other ways. Greg Beale takes note of the fact that it's very traditional to do, pardon me, what North and Gentry and McDermott and these guys do, and that's to break the law up into ceremonial, civil, and moral laws and build barriers, build fences between them. Now, here's what's interesting about Greg Beale. He says that's the common practice, but he says, quote, there is no exegetical basis for doing such a thing, unquote. Now, wait a minute. Here's Greg Beale, who says Jesus took away the ceremonial, but not the moral. Then he turns right around and says there is no exegetical basis for delineating between the moral, the civil, and the ceremonial laws under Torah. It's one law. Now, how much of double talk is that? You see the problem here, folks? Okay, back to Colossians 2. So Paul spoke of the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths, all which were indisputably part of that term, the law. Look, all you've got to do, get your Logos Bible study, get your online Bible study, get your Strong's Unabridged Concordance, get whatever Bible study aid that you use, and just look up the term, the law, in the Old Testament. Start with Exodus. Save a little bit of time. You will see what Greg Beale actually said. There is no exegetical basis for delineating between moral, civil, and ceremonial. The Old Covenant calls the sacrifices the law. It calls those laws having to do with the king and the administration of Torah through the government the law. It calls the Decalogue the law. And by the way, my Sabbatarian friends tried to delineate between the law of Moses, I'm sorry for that, folks. Oh my goodness gracious. Normally, if people don't call here at this time of night, I apologize for that. I hope it didn't kick me off. William, are we still on? William?
You are. You're doing well.
Pardon me?
Yeah, you're still on. Everything looks great.
Okay, well, I apologize for that. Like I said, my phone normally doesn't ring here at the office at 7:45, or at least not a lot it doesn't.
Okay. Well, don't worry about it. I mean, everything is going well. Just keep going.
Okay, very, very good. Thank you. Okay, as I said, there really is no exegetical basis for delineating between the different types of the law. It's just simply not there. But I want you to notice that in Colossians chapter 2, when Paul references new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths,
Make sure you put your screen back up.
uh, oh, um, so, okay, screen share. Is that it?
Just give it a minute. It should come back up
All right.
if you're sharing your screen.
I told it to. So, I don't know what else to do here. Do we not have the screen yet?
Not yet. I think it's coming up now.
Okay. Not used to this time lag here. Apologize for this, folks. I'm still very much learning this whole process of this Google Hangout and trying to learn this technology and what have you. William, do you think I should go back on and do the screen share back to myself and then back to the back to my charts?
Yeah, just try it and see what you get.
All right, let me go back here. Screen share. There I am. Oops. Come on. Screen share. And we will do this. What image do you have on the screen, William?
I have the image of Dunn at the moment.
Okay. Well, I really do apologize for that. Any suggestions, William?
Let's see what I can do here. And the one thing we forgot was to send me a copy just in case something like this happened.
Yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we are working through this process. But it was going along beautifully.
Well, now when I'm hitting screen share, it's not doing it. There we are. Come on. Screen share with this. I'm sitting here looking at my charts, and I had told it to screen share. So let me I see you. Let me do this one more time.
Well, if it doesn't, just go ahead and continue on through the presentation.
Okay, it's not bringing it up on my screen, William. When I minimize it, it's not showing me as on the bottom right-hand side. It's not showing my charts as a possible screen share.
So when you first clicked on screen share, did it show your charts in the background?
No, it's not showing my charts. I have my PowerPoint icon down in the tray. When I click it, it brings it up full screen, but it does not put it down here beside you or beside me where I can then click on it.
Mhm.
So I don't know why it's huh. Hmm. And see, some of the times when I click on screen share now, it's not even bringing up the little icon.
Right.
Okay, let me try this. I brought my charts back up. By the way, I noticed a question from a gentleman by the name of, yeah, Keith. The question is dominionism just another term to summarize all futurist eschatologies? And the question for that answer to that is no, it's not. Dominionism is also known as postmillennialism. That is the view held by American Vision, by Kenneth Gentry, Gary North that I've been mentioning, Greg Bahnsen, who, as I mentioned, has passed away. It is not the same as amillennialism. It is not the same as dispensationalism. It is its own distinctive brand, as a matter of fact, of post-millennialism. So, William, I'm going to go ahead and continue with my charts. I'll go off screen into my charts. And, Brian has asked us if this is going to be recorded. I'm assuming that it is, that it will be archived. So, anyway. Very good. Well, I will continue here. We've only got a few moments left for the program, so I will make a few further observations here in the time remaining. Let me reiterate what I began with here. Paul spoke of the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths, all of which were indisputably called, by terminology, the law. They were all referred to as part of the Old Covenant or simply as the covenant. Now, Paul's references here, new moons, feast days, and festivals, or feast days, are references to Israel's festal calendar. And I tell you what, folks, I think this is some of the most vital, yet ignored issues, not only when it comes to the passing of the law, but in all of eschatology. Many commentators fail to see the eschatological significance of the feast days. Some of you who are listening may remember when David Curtis presented what remains to me today just as an outstanding presentation on Israel's feast days and eschatology some years ago. And I will remember like it was yesterday. David wasn't even through with his lesson. I turned to my wife and I said, why have I waited this long in my life to see these truths? This is incredible. Well, let me tell you, I've been studying the feast days really hard ever since then. And to say that the feast days are eschatologically significant is one of the most humongous understatements that a person could possibly make. And yet, to reiterate, many commentators, amillennialists especially, post-millennialists especially, absolutely, utterly fail to see this connection. Now listen to me, look what Paul says. These new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, Paul said, when he wrote, were, quote, shadows of good things, or better things, if you please, about to come. Now here's something you need to understand, folks. Every new moon, almost every feast day, basically every one of them, they were all Sabbaths. All of Israel's 7 feast days was a Sabbath. What do you mean by that, Don? Well, a Sabbath was a cessation of work. It is when they stopped working, they were not to work, and they rejoiced in the Lord. Every one of Israel's 7 major feast days were Sabbaths. Now, I want you to catch the power of what I'm about to say, because this is really important. All of the Sabbaths pointed to the final rest of salvation, the resurrection, and the kingdom. Now, I'm not going to give chart after chart after chart after chart after chart that I could give you from Bahnsen, from the rabbis, from amillennialists, from Jewish writers. Look, I mean, this is one of the most axiomatic, undeniable facts in all of biblical theology. The Sabbaths represented the final rest of salvation, resurrection itself, and that resurrection rest in the kingdom. Now, William, we've only got about 4 minutes left here, so I'm going to summarize and close with the final chart here, and I have it entitled A Brief Primer on the Feast Days. And folks, if you're following along, I apologize if you cannot see the chart. William and I will have to work on this and see if we can't get this worked out. I really don't know what's going on here. Anyway, Israel had 7 major feast days. 7 of them. They began with Passover. Next was unleavened bread. They counted then the Feast of Weeks, and then Pentecost. Now, when Paul wrote, the first 4 of these typological feasts had been at least partially fulfilled, and they had been partially fulfilled spiritually in Christ's death, burial, resurrection, and what was known as the Feast of the First Fruits, in other words, Pentecost. However, the sabbatical element of those had not yet come to pass. When Paul wrote these feast days and what they foreshadowed had therefore been initially fulfilled, but what they ultimately foreshadowed was, about to come. So, once again, Israel had 7 feast days. Passover, unleavened bread, weeks, and Pentecost were the first 4. The fulfillment of those had been initiated. However, the next chart, the last chart we'll have time for, when Paul wrote, he said that the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths are, present active indicative, shadows of the good things about to come. Now notice he specifically mentions new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths. Now both Israel's religious as well as their civil calendars, yes, Israel had 2 calendars. Wouldn't that be confusing? Anyway, both Israel's religious and civil calendars began with new moon observances. Now catch this, folks. All 7 feast days were Sabbaths. They were days of rest, and they signified the coming Sabbath, as one writer expressed it. They signified the Sabbath reset of the Messiah and his kingdom, including resurrection life. Now, I'm going to stop right there and simply call attention to the fact that the last 4 of Israel's feast days were in fact new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths. And it particularly is significant because of the reference to the new moon. The last 3 feast days of Israel were considered to be the eschatological last days feast. That is, they pointed toward the last days. That was Rosh Hashanah, Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, and Feast of Harvest, Feast of Booths, Feast of Sukkot, Feast of Ingathering. Those are all names that were given to the final feast. Now, folks, the Feast of Trumpets, Sukkot, represented and symbolized the day of judgment. It is the Feast of Trumpet. Atonement comes after that. And in our continuing discussion, I'm going to show you why it is simply anachronistic and wrong to say the law was removed at the cross when we focus on atonement. Because to say the atonement, as most people do, was finished at the cross completely destroys the chronological flow of Israel's feast or festal calendar. It destroys the calendar countdown. The last feast day, Feast of Ingathering, this is the Feast of Resurrection. Mind you that Paul said those feast days were present active indicative when he wrote shadows of good things that are about to come. Now, folks, since Jesus said the law, not one jot or tittle from the law, could pass until it was all fulfilled, and since the last three feast days of Israel's sabbatical calendar, trumpets, atonement, ingathering, had not been fulfilled, you know what? That's an awful lot of jots and tittles that had not been fulfilled when Paul wrote. Therefore, Torah had not passed away when Paul wrote. This is extremely, extremely powerful, and boy, is it important. So, William, with that, I'm going to continue. I'm going to end tonight's session. I want to thank all the people that joined us in our chat room, and I'm going to turn it over to William.
All right. Well, thank you, Don. Excellent presentation tonight. Really apologize for the loss of the slides, but I may be able to do some editing to get those in, which means I'll have to put in a little bit more work on the recording. This recording will be available just almost immediately after we're done here. It will be on a YouTube channel, and we'll try to get it on a Google Plus page as well. And it may automatically be on there, but we'll check that out. Now, I don't know if you're able to see, Dunn, can you see in the screen on the right-hand side, can you see the image of the book?
Image of what book?
You can't see it, okay. All right. Then if you can't see it, the audience may not be able to see it as well, but I do have a copy of Torah to Telos, the End of the Law there, and person can if you click on that offer button to the right, let's see what happens if I try it. It may not show. We're still working with this, but it's there. It also has an add to cart button where you can purchase it, and Dunn may even offer you an incentive to do so. If you have not read this book, The End of the Law, Torah to Telos, The End of the Law, I would suggest that you get it. As you can see, the information that Dunn is sharing with you tonight, and how important it is. He talked about the present active indicative earlier. I was going to stop him, but his flow was going so well, I didn't want to interrupt the flow of what he was doing. And, to just kind of have him bring out these points a little bit more. And when he talked about the necessity in Deuteronomy 8 for every law to be observed, those are very important points in establishing this. And as he works through Colossians 2:14, but having the book will enhance your study of what's being said. In addition to this, something else that we're looking forward to doing, and that is we're going to be able to run this same webinar in Facebook live. So as we're doing it here, it will also be playing live in Facebook. We already have the technology. We just simply have to implement the technology. I was working on it last night, but didn't get it quite finished. But we'll be able to do that. You'll be able to interact right there from within Facebook in terms of seeing it. So I know that it might have been a little bit of a challenge for some of you to come here because you got to get used to Google Hangouts. just like we're getting used to it, but at least we're up and we're rolling, and we're taking a step each time to make this happen. So I don't want to keep you any longer. I know you're scheduled to be here for an hour, and we want to honor that. If there are any comments or questions, send us those questions on Facebook. Send them to Dunn. Go to my page. You know, you can go to any page that you see for me, which is All Things Fulfill Radio. And also, what else do I have over there? But even on my personal page, I know it's a bunch, but just find one and send us a question, send us a comment, anything that you want to send to help us to enhance this process, because we're going to be doing more of it. And I was really grateful tonight that Dunn's voice held up so well.
Me too. After the weekend in New York and
Yeah.
having so much fun up there, not to mention, you know, all the laughter and the visiting and fellowship and then speaking. I went into one store up there and my voice had almost disappeared, and someone asked me about it, and I said, well, I just got through speaking for almost an hour, and then we had a 3-hour Q&A session after that. So yeah, my voice is shot.
Yeah. So it did really well. All right, well, we're going to try to figure out what it takes to get the offers and the images up, make sure that we don't have this problem. We didn't have it before on the first pilot webinar, but we did experience it this time. So there's still some bugs that we're working out, and some of it could be in the technology itself, because there was one issue that they repaired during the week. But I think it's great. Once again, thanks to everyone who attended tonight. Looking forward to having you back on the next one. And Dunn, you know, I don't know whether you want to do them every week or whether you want to pace yourself a little bit, because we don't want to overwork you. But if you want to, because this felt good to me, you know, we kind of missed the other one because you were going to New York. We both forgot about it.
Yes.
But I think the pace of every 2 weeks is good too, unless you want to do them do them more often. But
I really think 2 weeks is going to be better with me, William.
Yes, I think so too. So let's schedule the next one out for 2 weeks. It'll give us a little bit more time to get the word out and get all the technology tested and everything that we're going to be using. So ladies and gentlemen,
William,
yes.
we have a question here from Brian Watson. What title should we use to find this video on YouTube?
Okay, what title? I haven't come up with the title, but Dunn and I worked it out. It'll be something like Colossians 2:14, when was the law of Moses fulfilled? As a matter of fact, I think you could probably go to my All Things Fulfilled channel, and it might be there shortly after this video. You should be able to find it pretty easily.
All right.
We'll also put it on the Google Plus page, and then once we get the link, we can put it on Dunn's page as well as mine. So
very
there
good.
won't be any problem. Okay.
Well, William, I want to thank you for working on this technology. As you well know, I'm a techno dummy, and without you, this would not get done.
Well, you know, it takes an effort amidst all the other things that are going on, but I'm grateful to be able to do it, and it's exciting because, you know, Google Hangouts has a lot of features that we haven't even touched the hem of the garment on in terms of what we are able to do with this. So we just want to continue to improve on it and have as many ways to get the message out and to help those of you who are out there listening and you want some information to be able to share with others. I mean, you could invite your students that you're teaching and classrooms here for the study and have an open, you know, basically a Bible study with this. So, you know, think about all the ways in which you can use it to get people here as well.
Amen.
And, I think it's just going to enhance that. All right.
All right. Well, I'm going to say good night and God bless.
Absolutely. Good night. God bless everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. All right. And we'll put a message out once the video is ready. We'll put the link out so you can watch. Okay? All right. Good night.